How much do you think the government shutdown now is a big impediment to what has been a pretty strong economy over the last year?
Well, I think it's going to be big, partly because of what Jamie Dimon just said. It's not just about the $1 billion a week or so that it's costing, far more than this fence or security fence would cost. It's about consumer confidence. It's about people like me believing that we're going to be able to get our act together on policy all the way down the line, whether it's trade or immigration. This is not that difficult of a problem to solve, the issue of border security. We're talking about, one side that was close to $2 billion, another side wants $5 billion. You can figure out, well, let's just have some fence and border security and appoint some blue ribbon panel led by Michael Chertoff and 3 generals from the Corps of Engineers, figure out what's the best way to do things and move on. The real problem is we have a government, and especially I think the president is pushing this in a way that we can't just move on, and it's going to hurt the economy in a direct way and certainly in an indirect way in terms of world confidence in our ability to do even the most simple things.
Bob, do you think that Washington policy broadly has turned from a tailwind to business and the economy last year, the corporate tax cuts, deregulation, into a headwind this year?
No, I don't think there's a headwind. I think the government shutdown will be resolved. And as we used to say in the automobile industry, if you run the numbers, you never take a strike. And what the president is doing, he's taking a strike. But we also knew that if you let the union creep and creep and creep and demand more and more and more, and you keep giving in to avoid a costly strike, ultimately you lose control. And I think President Trump has decided it's time to take a strike. Will it be somewhat costly? Yes, but so far from what I'm hearing from car industry, is there is no short-term effect, no real pressure on profitability or sales. The only thing is apparently certification of new models is getting delayed because the people at the EPA and other regulatory agencies that certify new cars are not working. So that queue is stacking up, and it's going to delay some new model introductions. But right now, they're really, on the car industry, as far as I'm able to ascertain, not much of a negative effect.
Walter, what do you think about this idea? Ben White wrote an article for Politico today that people close to the president, and this is White's reporting, says he tends to gauge economic risk by market reaction. So lack of big drops on Wall Street could be among the reasons he does not yet feel significant pressure to change the wall demands and end the shutdown. How should we feel about that?
Well, I think that's probably true. We saw he changed a little bit on China trade when the market reacted. I think that's a smart thing to do. The market generally knows what it's talking about. I do agree with Mr. Lutz that, sometimes you have to take a strike, so to speak, but it seems to me that there's deeper issues you have to deal with than exactly how you're going to do, the type of funding for border security. That's something that could be compromised pretty simply. And what worries me is that there's just no appetite for any sort of sensible getting people together and saying, how do we resolve these problems that you feel in Washington. So I'm hoping that and I see that with the Democrats coming in with the House of Representatives, same sort of thing. So I think that's a headwind, not just for the next quarter or so, but looking at the United States, I agree totally with Jamie Dimon. We got to find ways to get grown-ups who can say, we know how to handle these problems and make the cost-benefit analyses necessary.
Hey, Bob, on the trade war, I was looking back to an appearance you had on our show back in July of last year. You said what the president's trying to do is eradicate decades of ongoing monumental trade deficits, sucking the wealth out of our country. I guarantee you the U.S. will come out of this trade war as a winner. Still feel that way?
I totally stand by those statements. I can't believe how clever I was back then.
You said we wouldn't know more for a couple of months. It's obviously been more than that. At what point do you think it's taking too long?
Well, As long as progress is being made in trade talks, it's not taking too long. Meanwhile, we don't have tariffs. Like I said, we wouldn't have tariffs until the trade talks break down. And I think Senator Grassley is probably right. President Trump will probably decide to impose tariffs on European cars just in order to get the EU to finally move on tariffs. And as I keep repeating every time I get an opportunity, we have had decades of trade inequity in that our automotive tariffs are 2.5%, the European Union is 10%, and then on top of that, they impose a 25% value-added tax on American cars that already have a full tax load embedded in them. German cars that are exported from Germany do not pay the German value-added tax, and when they get to the United States, they don't pay a value-added tax either. So why should a Mercedes or BMW be lower priced in the United States than it is in its own home country? It makes absolutely no sense. And somebody said, well, the average imported car is going to go up by $6,000. I have news for you. A Mercedes should be $6,000 more than a conventional car. So I think President Trump, in my judgment, as usual, is doing the right thing.
It's funny, Walter, whenever I hear about VATs, I always think about the border adjustment tax as a part of tax reform and how much revenue that would have raised and addressed the trade issue. That's not my question to you, however. I want to come back to the government shutdown,
But
Walter.
I agree with you.
You know, I'm glad to hear that. What, beyond the economic impact, in terms of just having the government shuttered and certain agencies not working and certain things not being looked after, we've done a story on CNBC.com earlier this week, for example, about cyber and the risks there. You know, as this goes on, don't those risks continue to mount?
Yeah, I think you see both direct costs, but all sorts of indirect things, such as whether, the FBI and the guarding against cyber attacks is being done at full scale. It's sort of a weird type of shutdown where only a quarter of the government is shut down, but in certain ways there's an interconnectedness. And I keep going back to saying that it's also a psychological thing after a while. We see a whole dysfunction across the world these days. I mean, whether it's in Europe being dysfunctional, the British Parliament not being able to figure out how it's going to resolve one way or the other, or three ways or another Brexit, and then the U.S. Congress and the White House not being able to resolve simple things. I think it's probably time that a whole lot of people said, let's take a more mature approach to some of these things. We don't need to be testing. It gets back to the Jamie Dimon approach.